My daughter emailed me a single sentence that changed everything. "Don't come to my wedding." Just like that, I was erased from a life I'd built brick by brick. Imagine funding a celebration, only to be told you're no longer welcome at your own table. They say family is everything, but sometimes family is exactly what breaks you. Yet deep down, I believed even betrayal carried a hidden gift: clarity. What happened next wasn't revenge. It was the quietest revolution of my life. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss more stories like this. I stared at the screen longer than I probably should have. One simple subject line: wedding update. I clicked, expecting a final head count or maybe a sweet mother-daughter message. But what I found was a cold, corporate-sounding email from my own daughter, Emily. "Hi, Mom. We've decided to keep the wedding small. Here's a link to the live stream. Hope you understand." Just like that. No seat, no mention, just a link. It felt like being quietly erased. I had already given them $30,000 for the wedding. I didn't do it to be honored or thanked. I did it because that's what mothers do. But this was more than an oversight. It was a message. "You're not part of our picture anymore." I blinked back, the sting in my eyes, refusing to let the tears fall. Right then, the silence in my kitchen felt louder than ever. Even the old refrigerator seemed to hum with disapproval. I reread the message, hoping I had misunderstood, that there was some warmth hidden in the words. But there wasn't. It was deliberate, clean, surgical, as if someone had cut me out with scissors and threw away the scrap. I didn't reply right away. What could I say that wouldn't sound desperate? That I'd spent nights sewing her school play costumes? That I skipped my own birthday to work overtime so she could have ballet lessons? She knew. She always knew. And still she sent me a link, like I was just some distant relative, not her mother. I got up, poured myself a glass of water and sat at the table where I used to braid her hair. Everything felt smaller now. The room, the memories, me. It was like my entire motherhood had been placed into a storage box labeled optional. And yet, something inside me shifted. A calmness, not sadness, something quieter, sharper. And in that quiet, I made a decision. I would not beg for a seat at a table I paid to set. But if they thought this was the end of my part in the story, they were sorely mistaken. Because what Emily didn't know was that I still had one more transfer to make. One that would change everything. People think motherhood is all about birthdays and bedtime stories. But it's the invisible sacrifices that cost the most. The ones no one claps for. I remember the night Emily had pneumonia, and I stayed awake for 48 hours straight, holding a cold cloth to her forehead, while praying she'd breathe easier. I canceled a job interview that day. I never got another chance like that. But I never told her. I never wanted her to feel guilty for needing me. Vacations? I stopped dreaming of them after 1989, while other families posted beach photos. I was working weekends to afford school shoes. When the kids were young, I clipped coupons like a full-time job. I learned to make meals stretch for days and turned second-hand clothes into dresses that made Emily feel like a princess. She never saw the seams I had to stitch together just to keep everything from falling apart. I was both mother and father, cheerleader and nurse, counselor and janitor. And through it all, I asked for nothing. No medals, no thank yous. I just wanted to know I had raised kind humans who wouldn't forget where they came from. I thought that was enough. I thought love like that would echo back one day. But maybe I was just clapping for myself in an empty room all along. Looking back, I realize how often I vanished for the sake of someone else's comfort. I never bought myself a new coat if they needed one. Never lit a fire under my own dreams if theirs needed fuel. I told myself this was strength, that I was being noble. But now I wonder, was I just making myself easy to forget? That email wasn't the first erasure. It was just the boldest one, the final signature on a pattern I refused to see before. I was always the invisible glue holding things together. But glue doesn't get invitations. Glue gets scraped off when the picture's finally framed. That realization didn't come with rage. Just a strange, aching clarity. So I did what I always do when things feel too big to carry. I made coffee, sat on the porch, and listened to the wind. But this time, I didn't just reflect. I remembered. I remembered every dinner skipped, every tear hidden, every choice made for their sake, and I realized maybe it was time to finally make a choice for me. I replied with 2 words. Sure, enjoy. That was it. No questions, no sarcasm, no guilt. I think my silence frightened her more than any outburst would have. For once, I didn't rush to fix or explain. I let the coldness sit where she had placed it, between us, and I held it like a mirror, letting her see the emptiness she created. At work the next morning, I moved through the motions like a ghost. I served coffee, smiled at regulars, cleaned tables no one asked me to. The world didn't know my daughter had just disinvited me from her life. But Robert, my boss, noticed something in my eyes. He didn't ask. He just said, "Take a break, Margaret. I'll cover you." That simple kindness cracked something inside me. I stepped outside into the alley behind the cafe, where the air always smells like cinnamon and city dust. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. It wasn't just about the wedding. It was about years of silences like this, moments where I bit my tongue, swallowed the hurt, and smiled anyway. I began to wonder, how many times had I trained my daughter to ignore my pain? I remembered her teenage years, the slammed doors, the "You don't get it, Mom" cries, the times I stood outside her room just listening, too tired to fight but too loving to leave. I never matched her volume. I never gave her back the storm she sent my way. I thought that was maturity. Now I see, it was invisibility. And invisibility has a cost. Even now at this age, I still craved to be seen. Not worshipped, not praised, just seen, noticed, considered. I gave her so much room to take up space. I forgot to keep any for myself. And maybe this silence, this new kind of quiet, was my way of reclaiming that space without screaming for it. That night, I lay in bed and asked myself the question I'd avoided for years. What would happen if I stopped giving? Not out of spite, but self-respect. And just as I began to drift off, one small idea entered my mind. It started like a whisper, but it would soon become a turning point. The next morning, I didn't go straight home after my shift. Instead, I walked 2 blocks in silence to the bank where I'd opened an account decades ago. The teller smiled, called me by name, and asked if I wanted to sit. I nodded. My hands trembled slightly, not out of fear, but out of something deeper. For once, I wasn't doing something for someone else. I was doing it for me. I pulled out the slip with the scheduled transfer, $50,000, a gift, a final gesture to help cover the honeymoon, furniture, and whatever dreams Emily and Luke had painted. I had written a note to send with it. For your future. Love, Mom. I never imagined I'd tear it up instead. The teller asked, "Are you sure you want to cancel it?" I looked her in the eye. "Yes, I'm sure." As she typed into the computer, I felt a wave of warmth rush through my chest. Strange, isn't it? How taking something back can feel like giving yourself oxygen for the first time. That money didn't come from thin air. It came from skipped meals, late-night shifts, and 1,000 no's I told myself so they could have yeses. And now it would stay with me. Walking out of that bank, I felt taller somehow. Not proud, not smug, just whole. Like a woman who had been carrying too much for too long, finally set something heavy down. And in that space, freed from the burden, I felt something new growing. Not bitterness, but boundaries. The kind that say, I matter too. I went home, made myself a tuna sandwich, and ate it on the porch with the sun on my face. Emily still hadn't replied to my quiet, "Sure, enjoy." Not a follow-up, not a check-in. She probably hadn't even noticed, but she would. Not because I'd shout, but because the silence was about to become very loud. Because when love is taken for granted long enough, it doesn't vanish. It transforms. And what Emily didn't yet realize was that she hadn't just lost a bank transfer. She had just triggered something I didn't even know I still had. A plan. And now I want to ask you something. Have you ever carried a grief that others couldn't see? Let me know in the comments. I read every story shared here. The call started 2 days later. First Emily, then Luke, then Emily again. Voicemails stacked up like unopened letters. But I didn't press play. I turned my phone over face down on the table and poured myself a glass of wine. I sat on the porch in the same chair where I used to rock Emily to sleep. Now, I rocked myself into silence. The world didn't stop spinning because they panicked. The sun still warmed the faded paint of my railing, and the neighbor's dog still barked at passing cars. But there was a different kind of noise now, the sound of absence. It wasn't empty, it was echoing. A space once filled with guilt and urgency was now calm, and that calmness scared them. I could hear their confusion even through the muted ringtones. Why wasn't I responding? Why wasn't I rushing to fix what they broke? But the answer was simple. I had finally realized I was allowed to not answer. I was allowed to let the calls ring. I was allowed to be missed, not manipulated. As I sipped my wine, I watched the shadows stretch across the porch. I remembered the time Emily called me crying because Luke had forgotten their anniversary. I sent flowers in his name just to make her feel loved. She never found out. She just thanked him, and I smiled through the phone. That was the last time I played ghost for someone else's comfort. I didn't want apologies born from panic. I didn't want conditional affection. We love you, Mom, they might say now, but only when the money stopped flowing, only when the silence turned into consequence. And that isn't love. That's currency. That's survival dressed up as sentiment. And as the sky turned lavender and the air cooled, I whispered to no one in particular, I'm still here, and I still matter. But I knew this wasn't the end of their pursuit, because the real desperation, the kind that reveals someone's true heart, was just around the corner. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Luke showed up at my door. No warning, no text, just the sound of his car tires crunching against my gravel driveway. Like a storm I didn't order rolling in. I watched him through the window for a moment, letting him knock twice before I opened. His face looked tight, controlled, but his eyes darted with unease. We need to talk, he said, skipping hello entirely. I stood in the doorway, one hand resting gently on the frame, like I needed to steady myself. But I didn't. I wasn't shaken, not anymore. About what? I asked calmly. He seemed surprised I wasn't angry, or crying, or begging. Maybe he expected the same woman who always smoothed things over. But that woman had finally put herself back together. You can't just disappear, he said, stepping closer. Emily's a mess. She's crying. She doesn't understand why you're doing this. I raised an eyebrow. You mean why I didn't wire the rest of the money? The words hung in the air, heavy and precise. He blinked, stunned for a second, then nodded. Yes, that. So there it was. No sugarcoating. Just transaction over connection. I didn't disappear, Luke, I said quietly. I was erased. There's a difference. He started to speak again, but I lifted my hand gently, like pressing pause. Let me be clear. This isn't revenge. This is clarity. I gave and gave and gave, and then I was told to stay home and watch from a screen. My voice didn't shake. In fact, I'd never heard it sound so steady. He looked around the living room behind me like he expected something else. Maybe a lawyer. Maybe packed bags. Maybe regret. But I gave him none of those things. Get out of my house, I said slowly and softly, as if I were offering him tea. What? He blinked. You heard me. And I meant it. For the first time in years, I really meant it. He hesitated, then walked back to his car. I closed the door behind him, pressed my back against it, and let out a long breath. Not of sadness, but of release. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt free. But deep down, I knew that silence wouldn't last. Because desperation doesn't end quietly. It escalates. The shift in tone came fast. Emily's messages, once cold and clipped, were now flooded with exclamation points and emojis. We're sorry. Let's talk. You're overreacting. Mom. But I'd seen this pattern before. When control slips away, panic takes its place. What they feared wasn't losing me. It was losing what I provided. There's a difference. And I finally saw it clearly. Her latest text read, We really want you there, but we're behind on some costs. If you can help just one more time, we'll make sure you're part of everything." I stared at that sentence like it was written in bold red ink. If you help, suddenly my presence was a bargaining chip. Conditional, purchased, optional. My heart didn't break. It hardened gently. They weren't inviting me back into their hearts. They were reopening the vault. The desperation wasn't love. It was logistics. And I had become a line item in a spreadsheet titled, "Things We Need to Fix Before the Wedding." I was no longer a mother. I was a contingency plan. And it hurt, but not in the way they expected. The truth is, I didn't need to be included in a party I paid to host. What I needed was to feel like I wasn't disposable, that my worth wasn't measured in wire transfers and RSVP counts, that somewhere, beneath all the adulting and planning, my daughter still saw me as the woman who stayed up all night with her fevered brow. But Emily was no longer whispering from her childhood bedroom. She was typing from a place of convenience. I wasn't angry anymore. I was simply done. And done is a peaceful place when you've spent your life in emotional debt. I deleted the messages. Not with rage, but with finality. Still, I knew their next move would be bolder. Because when guilt stops working, people try whatever's left. And that whatever was about to arrive. Not as a message, but as a memory from Emily's past. Now standing on my front steps. It had been years since I'd said yes to a lunch invitation that wasn't family-related. So when Robert, my boss, asked me again, this time with gentleness in his voice, I finally agreed. "You need a break from that cafe," he said with a chuckle. "And maybe from the people who think you're just a paycheck, with legs." I smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was true. We sat at a small Italian place down the block. The kind of place with faded menus and wine bottles lining the shelves like dusty trophies, over a bowl of pasta, and a glass of something red and forgiving. I finally let my guard down. I told him everything, not in a dramatic monologue, just simple truths. No tears, just facts, spoken like a woman who was done editing herself. Robert didn't interrupt. He didn't offer quick fixes. He just listened, really listened. And when I finished, he placed his fork down, leaned forward and said, "Margaret, love isn't alone. You don't owe them your peace for their approval." That sentence wrapped itself around my ribs and held me steady. It was the first time in weeks I felt seen without being needed. I realized then that I had spent decades at emotional gunpoint, smiling to avoid confrontation, giving to earn worth, and staying quiet so others could stay comfortable. But that afternoon, with marinara on my sleeve and laughter softening my shoulders, I remembered a part of myself I thought I'd buried under everyone else's needs. Choice. Choice to show up, or not. To give, or not. To forgive, or not. And none of those choices made me a bad mother. They made me a woman, reclaiming her own story. I paid the bill before Robert could argue. I had already paid enough in other ways. As we stood outside under the fading sun, he said, "Whatever you decide next, make sure it's for you." I nodded, and I knew exactly what that next step would be, because soon, someone unexpected was about to arrive at my door. Someone from Emily's past with one final question that would test everything I had just rediscovered. I was folding laundry when I heard the knock. It wasn't rushed or forceful, just 3 soft taps, almost hesitant. I opened the door and blinked in surprise. Standing there was Sophia, Emily's childhood friend. Her face carried that familiar gentleness, the kind that once filled our home during sleepovers and birthday parties. She held a small gift bag in one hand, and uncertainty in the other. "Hi, Mrs. Jenkins," she said, like time hadn't passed. I smiled faintly. "It's Margaret now. You're grown." She looked down, then met my eyes again. I came because Emily doesn't know what else to do." She paused. "She asked me to talk to you, to see if there's anything that could change your mind." Her voice cracked near the end, and I could tell this wasn't easy for her either. I invited her in, offered her tea, and we sat quietly for a moment. The kind of silence that doesn't beg to be filled, only felt. She looked around the living room like it still belonged to her childhood memories. You always made this place feel like home, she whispered. More than Emily remembers, I think. That hit me harder than I expected, because maybe she saw what my daughter no longer did. I loved Emily with everything I had, I said slowly. But love without respect becomes performance. Sophia nodded, tears gathering, but not falling. I continued. This isn't punishment. It's a line. A boundary I should have drawn years ago. Not to push her away, but to find myself again. My voice stayed calm, steady, like I was finally narrating a story that deserved to be heard. She reached into the little gift bag and pulled out a photo. Emily, me, and Sophia from 15 years ago. Smiling, whole. She kept this, she said. It's worn at the edges. Maybe she didn't forget as much as you think. I looked at it, felt the corners of my mouth turn, with a grief-tinted smile. But nostalgia is not enough to rebuild trust. Not anymore. I stood, gently placed the photo back in her hands and said, "Tell her I said no." Kindly, firmly, finally. Sophia stood too, eyes glossy with emotion. "She may not understand now," she said. I nodded. Maybe one day she will, but until then, I have to understand myself. And just like that, Sophia walked out of the house, and I stepped more fully into it. The wedding came and went, or rather, it almost did. I heard through a neighbor that the venue was cancelled last minute. Something about budget constraints and sudden disagreements. In the end, they held a small backyard ceremony with folding chairs and paper lanterns. I wasn't invited. And this time, I didn't wait for the mail or refresh my inbox hoping for a last-minute inclusion. I spent that day watering my plants, organizing my pantry, and listening to Billie Holiday records. I didn't wear black or cry or even check their social media. I lit a candle, not for mourning, but for peace. My peace. For years, I had negotiated my identity in quiet rooms, behind closed doors, trading pieces of myself for closeness. But now, I was done bargaining. There's a freedom that comes when you stop explaining your worth, when you stop chasing apologies that come with price tags. I wasn't angry. I wasn't bitter. I was simply elsewhere, in a life where I wasn't edited out, pixel by pixel, in a story where I didn't have to fight for a sentence of love. I had rewritten the narrative, not with revenge, but with resolve. Emily didn't call. Luke didn't text. The silence was no longer sharp. It was soft, a space I had earned. And in that space, I began to fill my days with small, bright things. Morning walks, handwritten letters to old friends, lemon cake on Sundays. Life didn't become extraordinary overnight, but it became mine, fully mine. One afternoon, my grandson Thomas, Emily's son, showed up with a handmade card. "I miss you," it read, in crooked blue letters. "Mom says you're mad, but I'm not." I held that card like it was made of glass and smiled at him through tears. "Come in," I said, and just like that, love found a crack and slipped in. Honest, quiet, and unearned. Because in the end, peace isn't something you beg for. It's something you claim. And once you taste it, you never let it go again. Not for tradition, not for appearances, not even for family. Especially not for family, who only remember you when it's time to pay the bill. I closed the door on the world that erased me and opened it again, just wide enough for peace to walk in. In the end, peace isn't something you ask permission for. It's something you claim. Sometimes the greatest acts of love mean setting boundaries, even with those you cherish most. I learned that choosing myself didn't make me less of a mother. It made me more of a woman. And maybe, just maybe, that's the lesson Emily still needs to learn. Have you ever felt invisible to the people you loved most? Maybe it's time you step back into your own story too. If this story touched your heart in any way, please hit the like button, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. And if this story reminded you of someone you love, I read every single comment. And it means more than you know.